Coming to you now is Lechem Panim with your host, Pastor Cameron Uri, Senior Pastor and Bible Teacher at Renton Park Chapel in Renton, Washington.
Hello, and welcome to the show today. We've been studying the book of Esther, last week talking about the rise of Xerxes and the war that he was engaged in with Greece, the next major world empire. And this helps us to understand this feast in our passage today in Esther chapter 1, how it was one that was meant to display Xerxes' greatness and ability, not just to rule well, but to be strong enough to lead his army into victory in this war against the Greeks. It says in verses 5 through 8 of Esther chapter 1, "And when these days were completed, the king gave for all the people present in Susa the citadel, both great and small, a feast lasting for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were white cotton curtains and violet hangings fastened with cords of fine linen and purple, to silver rods and marble pillars, and also couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Drinks were served in golden vessels, vessels of different kinds, and the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king. And drinking was according to this edict. There is no compulsion. For the king had given orders to all the staff of his palace to do as each man desired." Now, what this no compulsion meant was that King Ahasuerus, or Xerxes as he's also known, he set aside the custom that everyone had to drink whenever the king drank. Guests could drink whenever they wanted, as much as they wanted. And in addition to drinking for fun and leisure, the Greek historian Herodotus explained that the Persians drank as they deliberated matters of state, believing that intoxication put them in closer touch with the spiritual world. And so you have this prolonged, drunken, pervasively worldly and pagan feast going on in Susa. And on top of this feast, you also have another feast for the women. It says in verse 9, Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women in the palace that belonged to King Ahasuerus. So you have feast after feast. And in fact, the book of Esther is filled with feasts. The word mishta, meaning banquet or feasting, it occurs 55 times in the Old Testament, 20 of which are right here in the book of Esther. In fact, 9 feasts are here in the book of Esther, and 10 if you count the last one as 2. 7 of Esther's 10 chapters refer to somebody throwing a party. In fact, the whole purpose of the book of Esther is to show how one major feast that Jews celebrate even till today, the Feast of Purim, came into being. And we'll talk more about that in upcoming weeks. But for now, just kind of keep this feast theme in the back of your mind. Verse 10. "On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, and Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown, in order to show the peoples and to the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at." Now imagine this. Your husband invites you to come out in front of a bunch of his guests, who are slobbering drunk, by the way, so that they can stare at you and see what a trophy your husband has. Yet what gets me here is that King Ahasuerus, he's inviting his men to lust after his wife, to devour her with their drunken eyes. Now that's absolutely disgusting to me, and it should be disgusting to you as well. He objectifies her, and he's inviting all his friends to do the same. Now, to engage in that kind of behavior is absolutely wrong. Remember, Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5 in the Sermon on the Mount, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart." And what he's saying is that anything that objectifies a woman is wrong. When you use a woman for your own selfish pleasure, degrading her, you are in sin. Jesus doesn't want us to have any part of that whatsoever. And guess what? Queen Vashti doesn't want to have any part of that either. It says in verse 12, "But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, delivered by the eunuchs." Now, we're not told why Vashti refuses to come, Some have suggested that perhaps she refused because lewd behavior was expected. Some have suggested that the command for her to wear her crown was really a command to come wearing only her crown. And that might be the case, we don't know. However, it's interesting to note that from what we know in history, Vashti was actually seen to give birth to Ahasuerus' third son, Artaxerxes, in and around 483 BC. So it's very possible that she's actually pregnant during this time. Now, in our culture, we've made pregnancy a very public thing. But in ancient culture, you would often go into seclusion. It was an embarrassing, sometimes shameful thing to be seen when you were pregnant. And it's possible, therefore, that this is why Vashti is so resistant. And even the fact that Ahasuerus tells her to do this, it shows an extreme lack of care for her and her honor. He's so focused on himself, and that's apparent when we see that after he hears the news of her refusal, it says, "At this the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him." Now, one thing you're going to see, not only here, but in and throughout the book of Esther, is that Ahasuerus has a very hot and violent temper. And if you know anyone who is prone to anger, you'll know that they are in bondage to that anger. It controls them. In fact, a year after this, when Ahasuerus eventually does march against Greece, he has to cross the Hellespont, which is a narrow body of water that lies between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. And so he orders bridges to be built. And so they're built. But before his troops could use them, a storm rises up and destroys them. And he becomes so enraged, he gathers all the engineers together who designed the bridges and has them beheaded in his presence. Then he turns his rage to the water that had swallowed his bridges. History tells us he sent some of his soldiers into water with whips, telling them to lash the water 300 times as punishment for swallowing his bridges. And so they lashed the waves with those whips 300 times. And then he has his soldiers throw shackles into the water to bind the water, and even has them take red-hot irons and stab the waves with them. Now imagine having a ruler like that. Or even worse, imagine having a husband like that. Some of you may have grown up in a home where you saw that kind of anger often, maybe even on a daily basis. I've counseled people who have been in those kinds of situations, and let me tell you, Jesus doesn't want there to be any kind of room in our lives for that kind of anger. Colossians 3:8 says, "But now you must also rid yourselves of all such things as these: anger, rage, malice." Jesus doesn't want anger to control our lives. Anger destroys relationships, and it ultimately destroys ourselves. And someone who has rage as a part of their life is a slave to that anger. There's righteous anger that moves us to act in accordance with God's will, and then there is selfish anger and rage that is destructive rather than constructive. And it's the destructive kind of anger that is sin. And we see that Ahasuerus, at least at this point in his life, is a slave to that kind of anger. Now it says in verse 13 and following, "Then the king said to the wise men who knew the times," for this was the king's procedure toward all who were versed in law and judgment, the men next to him being Karshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who saw the king's face and sat first in the kingdom. According to the law, what is to be done to Queen Vashti, because she has not performed the command of King Ahasuerus, delivered by the eunuchs? Then Memucan said in the presence of the king and the officials, "Not only against the king has Queen Vashti done wrong, but also against all the officials and all the peoples who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt, since they will say, 'King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come.' This very day the noble women of Persia and Media, who have heard of the queen's behavior, will say the same to all the king's officials, and there will be contempt and wrath in plenty." You see, they're afraid that Vashti's disobedience will spark a women's liberation movement. And so they say, "If it pleases the king, Let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be repealed, that Vashti is never again to come before King Ahasuerus. And let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. So when the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all his kingdom, for it is vast, all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. This advice pleased the king and the princes, and the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent letters to all the royal provinces, to every province in its own script, and to every people in its own language, that every man be master in his own household, and speak according to the language of his people. Now here, Ahasuerus, he's told not just to command that Vashti be dethroned, but that he do it in such a way so as to make it impossible for anyone, including himself, to repeal that command. And so he does. He dethrones her for her disobedience. He's so concerned about how she made him look that he never stopped to consider how he made her look. Now, I think he regretted his mistake. It says in verse 1 of chapter 2, after these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. You see, he regrets his actions. And ultimately, that's where anger leads us, regret. He had driven his wife away, and when he comes to his senses, it's too late. And what bothers me about this situation is that their relationship could have been restored in the first place if only he had been willing to acknowledge that he had made a mistake and sought to treat his wife more fairly. But he doesn't. Instead, he does what's in his own self-interest and what's in the interest of those around him, the Memucans of his kingdom, not what's in the best interest of his wife. But I think he may have had a change of heart after this, and the reason I tend to think this way is because we see in and throughout the story of the book of Esther, he treats Esther differently. There's no evidence that he objectified her in the same way that he did Vashti. And when she appears to model the same kind of defiance when she later approaches the king uninvited, he shows mercy where he could have shown anger. I think her marriage to him may have affected his demeanor in a very positive way. There was something special about Esther. And next week we'll begin to explore what that was. But there are some key lessons that we can learn from Ahasuerus. This book, it opens up with a sense of lostness and brokenness. Lostness and brokenness that is the natural result of pride and anger. Ahasuerus sent into exile the very person that he cared about. And maybe sin in your life has cost you something. Maybe it is already hurting your marriage or your relationships. It might be anger, it might be lust, maybe it's putting your own needs ahead of someone else's, whatever it is. Jesus wants us to be willing to surrender our pride, to admit when we're wrong, and to help us to treat those we claim to love lovingly, even as he first loved us. Let's commit to do so. Amen.
Today's episode of Lechem Panim has been made possible by Renton Park Chapel, a church that is committed to the ministry of sharing the joy of hearing and doing God's Word, and to the mission of bringing people into the life-giving presence of Jesus Christ in and through vibrant preaching, teaching, Bible study, prayer, and ministry to a world that is in desperate need of the healing touch of Jesus Christ. If you'd like to learn more about our ministry here at Renton Park Chapel, or would like to request any of our messages here on Lechem Panim, you can visit us online at rentonparkchapel.org or lechempanim.org. You can also find us on both Facebook and Twitter. We look forward to hearing from you, and thank you for listening. And may you know all the fullness of having in your life the bread of the presence of God.